Okay, so I want to focus on one small part of our master's program in urban development planning at the DPU, the overseas field trip, as part of that program. It's a program which normally attracts between 30 and 35 international students every year. Probably we have in the vicinity of amongst 30, 35, we normally would have about 27 different nationalities within that course. So it's an extremely mixed group of people. This happens in a course that aims to produce future urban practitioners with a particular focus on cities and urban areas in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And by way of very brief background, these are cities where statutory planning has often been imposed either through colonial inheritance or through neo-colonial processes. And in both cases, this tends to cause a large proportion of the urban population to live in some level of informality in the city, in a context where governments are unable or unwilling to cope with the rate of urban growth. So by informality, I mean conditions like this, where people live in informal housing with limited or no access to formal infrastructure, water, sanitation, and often, but not always, combined with informal livelihoods. Although these populations living in informal settlements are extremely heterogeneous, the highest proportion of those people living there are low-income households. And in these cities, often the planning system at work is working against this kind of settlement. It works against it at best if it ignores it, at worst if it leads to mass eviction of people from land that many of people may have lived on for up to 30 years or more. So this is also, on the other hand, also plagued by a misunderstanding or a lack of acknowledgement of the contribution that informal settlements actually play in urban areas. And planners are certainly implicated in that process as well. Just to give you a sense that this level of informality, for example, in a city like Bombay, is up to 50% of all of that city. In African cities, it can go as high as 90%. In other cities, it may only be 20%. So we're talking about large sections of the population, often with very high densities. Now, this in its own right seems to me to raise ethical questions. In other words, the kind of planning that we engage with. And certainly if that kind of planning is implicated in people living in these sort of conditions, then we need really to rethink that type of planning. In brief terms, we argue that this calls for the formulation of a very different kind of urban practitioner who can think critically about planning and urban development in international development, who can act judiciously in a way that actively engages with an ethical practice that is transformative, that involves working collectively in a participatory manner, and that is open to learning and action in a continuous reflexive process. The field trip, as part of this course, contributes to this by developing capacities to understand urban development and urban change through becoming spatially and socially embedded in action learning alliances in a particular place. It encompasses a process of mutual learning and participatory action research and planning with the aim of consolidating and developing learners' knowledge and practice related to urban development. I'm going to draw on two experiences of two different field trip destinations. On our experience of working in Bangkok and of working in Dar es Salaam. In Bangkok, we worked with a government agency and an active and very strong network of communities in the context of a national housing policy that was actually inspired and driven by communities themselves. In the context of Dar es Salaam, we work with NGOs and a growing network of communities in a community-led engagement with government agencies with very different capacities and willingness to work with communities. In other words, that relationship is much more tenuous, more difficult, and contested. Given that we are a university in the global north, working with partners in the global south, we immediately encounter another layer of complex politics and ethics in practice. These two cases actually, interestingly, present very different historical, political, economic, and socio-cultural context. As it happens, in the context of Thailand, it's a country without a colonial history, traditional colonial history. In the context of Tanzania, we're talking about a country with multiple colonial history. And of course, our fundamental ethical challenge in this process is how can we build relationships with partners in these places that are not extractive, that are not subordinating, and that are not a form of what's become known as development tourism. Guarding against these negative consequences can be present in field-based learning anywhere in the world, I would argue, including London. But it takes on a particular form in these different global north, global south relationships. A key challenge, therefore, ethical challenge for us in doing these field trips is to build partnerships of equivalence with our partners so that the knowledge generated through the field trip is co-produced and is of value to all involved, to all the partners involved, that can create the conditions for a form of translocal learning where learning flows through global and local scales in different ways. Very briefly, I want to draw your attention to key entry points in building these partnerships of equivalence in 3 moments in the field trip process, and we can take this up in more detail in discussion if you're interested. The pre-field trip process for us is around creating the basis for responsible learning, and I want to draw your attention to 2 key entry points here. On the one hand, the pre-field trip experience is grounded in an initial engagement with partner organizations and communities with whom we have a continuous dialogue and co-definition about the objectives, the sites where we're going to work, and very importantly, what our partners can manage, because that can be a very big risk in the process, that partners actually can't manage the arrival of 30 students at a place in order to do various to work in the field. So this is a process of continuous dialogue and negotiation, and without that kind of process, you run the danger of getting yourself in a position of potentially imposing or being exploitative in the relationship. On the other hand, we would argue that there's also a level of preparation that has to be done with the students. In order to counter challenges like development tourism, like being extractive, etc., it's very important that the students themselves become informed outsiders. They will always be outsiders. There's nothing to be done about that. But at least they can become informed outsiders with informed questions, with a clear strategy for dealing with what in most cases is very imperfect information, and to identify and be aware of the preconceptions and assumptions that they may be making about the field before going there. The second moment to think about that I want to talk about is during the field trip, where we try to create the conditions for co-production of knowledge. And there are many different entry points I could look at here. I'm going to just focus on 2. One is around acknowledging the skills and the routines that actually come from the field itself. In other words, many people go to the field with an idea of how to do research, of methodologies they can use, already preconditioned before they get there. And I think what's interesting about both the communities we work with is that they themselves have developed their own skills and routines, their own way, for example, of doing enumerations, of doing mapping, of some of them quite sophisticatedly working with GIS. And I think it's a very negotiated process as to the kinds of methodologies and skills that you develop together with communities on the ground in a way that adds value to the partnership. The second issue that I wanted to raise around the field trip itself is that the visit itself can be a strategic opportunity for our partners to make their work more visible. And so this has been used in different ways by for example, the government in the government agency we worked with in Bangkok, used it to foster an understanding of community-led processes with other government agencies who did not support that approach. And so by inviting them to be part of our discussions, it was also a way for them to talk to those people, engage them in a different way of understanding the delivery and the support of the housing process in Thailand. In the case of DAR, it helped in our meetings for our partners to invite government in. In many cases, those partners have never been to meetings with communities. So it was a reason for inviting people in and then engaging them on a longer term basis through the process after our visit. Finally, again, there are a number of issues I could say about a post-field trip situation, but here we really focus on creating the basis for ongoing reciprocal learning. Again, there are 2 points I'd like to raise here. The one is the responsibility of sharing findings. And this is not an easy process. To share findings well in a digestible way, and what we also talk about with our partners is to share not just the synthesis and the analysis, but also the raw data and the mapping. Because in many cases, those are sources of data which they can use in other ways, which they themselves haven't collected. So there's a range of issues to think about in that process. And your partnership can break down at this point if this isn't done well. The final point that I wanted to make is that we see these as ongoing partnerships. So we're in a relationship of a 3 or 4 year cycle. It's not a kind of in and out relationship. So the field trip actually, we look for fostering longer term relationships, building the collective basis for joint research, for internships, for other forms of knowledge sharing and exchange. And I think this is a very important element of building equivalence in your partnerships. So finally, just to